The Chinese government is trying with increasing ferocity to use its economic and diplomatic clout to silence critical voices abroad and to undermine global institutions that protect human rights. China has obviously long censored critics at home. The government is now trying to extend that censorship to the rest of the world.
Activists there are saying Beijing is using the territory's police to enforce a policy of ever greater brutality. But support for the Communist Party's line among the police in Hong Kong is not universal. Some are risking their jobs, or worse, by speaking out.
When David Chan joined the Hong Kong police force a few years ago, he never thought that he would see scenes like these. David Chan is not his real name. This was last November when protesters and police clashed for hours on a university campus. Hong Kong police had come under massive attack. Hong Kongers criticizing and often cursing at the police. Many officers are on edge. They've been accused of indiscriminate arrests, beating up subdued protesters and threatening to shoot tear gas into apartments. Videos of alleged police brutality are circulating online. Bystanders who get into arguments with officers risk getting pepper sprayed, a clear violation of the rules as David learned them.
I'm just frustrated because some officers really dislike the protesters, and honestly, they really want to beat them up. But I think this isn't the right mentality. We should be impartial as police officers. We shouldn't take sides.
He says he's currently doing as much as 100 hours of overtime every month. While he isn't serving at the front line, as backup he often has to be at the site of demonstrations. David is hiding his identity for fear of being bullied by protesters online, and he worries about professional repercussions.
As a member of the Hong Kong police force, I shouldn't be criticizing it in public. But as a citizen of Hong Kong, I have to say, the senior officers have basically messed it up.
Officials deny the police have done anything wrong. The police has been in the focus of the demonstrators since June, when they first violently broke up a protest. Since then, public anger has steadily grown, especially among the young.
A new human rights report about China's oppression and suppression of human rights. Good day to you, Matthias. Can you fill us in on some of the report's details that shows China working for, quote, a dystopian future at home and abroad? Probably the most disturbing part of the report, certainly for people abroad. Where does Human Rights Watch consider China's threat to human rights overseas most severe? Is there a specific area?
Well, one of the groups, for example, that have really been targeted are the Uyghurs abroad. They have been threatened abroad. They have been their family members have disappeared, and all of this was used to suppress their criticism. Chinese groups of pro-government supporters have been mobilized, for example, on universities across the world to counter protests against China's human rights record, and there has also been pressure on the human rights mechanisms, the international human rights mechanisms, as well as on countries that are financially dependent on China to support China's oppression policies, for example, in Xinjiang. What we can clearly say is that this system of governance in China would not be able, the power of the Communist Party would definitely not survive in the way it is exercised now without this massive repression and this massive censorship.
The Chinese government depends on repression to stay in power. As a result, it views the global defense of human rights as an existential threat. Now, the Chinese people are like everyone else. They want the right to live freely and in dignity. But President Xi Jinping is overseeing the most brutal and pervasive oppression that China has seen in decades. Civic groups are being shut down. Independent journalism is no more. Online conversation has been curtailed.
Chinese Premier Li Keqiang emphasized that China wants to be a staunch safeguard and contributor to regional and global peace and development. As China sticks to its multilateral approach to global governance and the Belt and Road Initiative, how can China contribute to the global efforts to achieve the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals? So Premier Li Keqiang last year met with Mr. Ashim Steiner, who is the attributor of the United Nations Development Program. The country is willing to align its development planning with the UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, meaning the 17 Sustainable Development Goals.
Freedom for the people of Hong Kong is being challenged. And for the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims of Xinjiang, China has imposed the most intrusive system of surveillance the world has ever seen and has detained 1 million people for forced indoctrination. Now, China is determined to avoid criticism of these deeply disturbing trends. It has long censored people within China. It is now trying to extend that censorship to the rest of the world.
I think newsrooms in particular, there's a reason why they have people on the staff, actual former physicians and things, that are constantly talking about different diseases or illnesses that are coming up, so that they continue to build that trust, so that when there is a situation like this, there is already somebody on staff from the medical professional that's a trusted voice, whether it's on any of the networks, that's able to speak up.
Actually, you made a point earlier about the anti-vaccine movement that's going forward right now, and there was going to be a community event tomorrow in New York City that actually ended up being canceled yesterday because it was only anti-vaccine advocates as a part of a community event, and nobody from the professional medical community would join even in the conversation. So the organizers ultimately, because they were shamed into that imbalance, canceled the event.
Excellent. For me, my learning was the risk of misinformation and disinformation. I think it requires a lot more thought and coordination across the stakeholders.
Not just public safety avenues ready, including military. Are they ready for such civil unrest if it were really to get out?
Now, some autocrats and dictators are happy to go along. Some powerful governments that could stand up to China have been too divided or distracted. And China is quite willing to use money to force censorship, whether of governments or businesses, by threatening to deny them access to the Chinese market. The voice of the United Nations on human rights has also been a major target of China, and with considerable success. At the UN Security Council, China joins up with Russia to block any action on such human rights crises as Syria, Venezuela, and Myanmar. Governments should band together to challenge Beijing's repression. China cannot stand up to the entire world all at once. The bottom line is, now is the time to resist China's assaults on the international human rights system. Decades of progress on human rights are at stake. So is our future.
I wanted to follow up on the trusted voice idea. I think everyone around the table spoke about how important it is to find those voices. Do we need to find them now and establish trust in those voices now, so that when the crisis hits, people already have the established trust?
Our next guest is one of the richest and most generous men in the world. Please welcome Bill Gates. Hi, Bill.
Hi.
Yeah. So my question is, you warned everybody about this in a TED Talk in 2015. You predicted this would happen. And so I'm sure you're very prepared because you knew this was going to happen. Do you feel like you prepared for this? I mean, even though this probably surprised you beyond what you expected.
This is even, worse than war, and yet the amount that was put into it, the amount we practiced and had, the ability to make these tools, virtually nothing was done.
Obviously, this administration is blaming the last administration, saying they didn't have anything. Did anyone listen to you? Was there something, and then it was then then everybody abandoned it, or what happened exactly?
Well, it's hard to know how much to spend on something that you can't really compute the probability in any particular year that it's going to come. Because until we get almost everybody vaccinated globally, we still won't be fully back to normal. We want to go, and manufacture and do construction and go to school, but there will be things like big public events where the risk will outweigh the risk of a disease rebound.
So you just said June, but we aren't going to have any vaccines for probably a year.
Progress takes time, and the social isolation is buying researchers time to find the answers that we need. What is your most hopeful time frame for how long we have to live the way we are now?
Well, there's two ways out. One is if we get miracle therapeutics that are greater than 95% cure rate. We can't count on that. And the other is a vaccine that's highly effective that we get out to the world population. Some of those vaccines, we'll understand by this summer. We'll see, because they're going into humans now, we'll see if they get this strong antibody response. And then, then we have to do broad safety testing and get the manufacturing going. So even a year from now, if everything went perfectly, because we're backing, 10 of the leading constructs, we could start the manufacturing. Most of the work we're going to do to be ready for pandemic 2, I call this pandemic 1, most of the work we'll do to be ready for that are also the things we need to do to minimize the threat of bioterrorism.
You delivered a TED Talk where you predicted pretty much what is happening now. Now, thanks to the world we live in, that has sprouted a bunch of conspiracy theories. Everything from Bill Gates invented this virus to prove himself right, or he knew it was going to happen and that's why he said it. Was that TED Talk about this virus, or was that a hypothetical that has now come true?
Well, I didn't know specifically that it'd be coronavirus and that it would hit in late 2019. But the goal of the talk was to encourage governments to make the investments so we could respond very quickly and keep the case numbers very, very low. And so sadly, this is not a case where, I feel like, hey, I told you so. Because we didn't use that time when it was clear as the biggest threat to kill millions of people, to have the diagnostic standing by, to be ready to ramp up a vaccine factory. A few things were done. Some countries, our foundation funded some work that will help with the vaccines now, will help with the diagnostics, but most of what was called for, those things didn't get done, and so that's why it's taking us a long time to get.
How is it that you, as a non-government, knew this information and knew that it needed to be acted on, and governments and organizations that are specifically tasked with protecting people from this very thing either didn't have the information or ignored it. What do you think happened there? Because I know you interact with governments, you talk to organizations like the CDC, like the WHO.
Well, there are lots of individuals who were as worried as I was. You know, people like Dr. Fauci.
Wanted to bring you some pretty stunning comments from Dr. Anthony Fauci, who basically just admitted why and how the government lied to us about the efficacy of wearing masks. Let's take a listen as he explains the real reason they told us not to do that.
What about a month or so, or 2 or 3 ago, when people were saying, you don't really need to wear a mask? Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who you know were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected, we did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed.
It is
just admits
hard.
it on live television.
Yeah,
it's insane.
Hard to overstate how outrageous it is that he's just like, because he says, oh, people were saying, no. The Surgeon General and the U.S. government were saying, don't wear a mask, not because we need these critical supplies for our frontline healthcare workers, which would have been that. Like, yes, tell us that people would have listened. No, there was a whole elaborate rationales and many articles written about how masks didn't really work, so don't buy masks, don't wear masks. In fact, they may make things worse, but also, oh, by the way, our healthcare professionals are definitely going to be wearing them. Which never made sense. You're like, if they don't work, then why does it matter for them to have them? It never made sense. And then it comes out, he just admits they were blatantly lying to us.
They lied to us to keep supply. And you know what? If they had just been honest with Americans and said, hey, please don't buy a mask right now. We need the mask, all the professional masks for professionals. Make one out of a towel that you have laying around, an old towel, cut it up. We'll show you how to do it. Fine. Right. Who would not have done that? I would have done it. So would have millions of other Americans.
Right.
Instead, they lied. How many people died? And now we're actually learning. Out of all of the things, remember Fauci at the time was like, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash my hands 30 times a day. Not a lot of efficacy to washing your hands. Hand sanitizer. Number one most important thing, wearing a mask is what they say in crowded places. And that the method of transmission, it's not even off surfaces. It's if you're in an enclosed area where people are talking loudly and where there's not a lot of air circulation, which is highly populated. And the number one way that you can cut down on that is to wear a mask whenever you're in such an environment. And so it's just like all of a sudden, we're just like all wearing masks now. I can't even get service at a restaurant if I don't have my mask on. A couple months ago, people were just walking around willy-nilly. How many people died because of that? I just think this is the greatest public health scandal in a generation.
It really is. And as we're talking about this, we are seeing a spike in a lot of states. 10 states saw a record number of new COVID cases this week. Florida, in particular, is looking like a potential new epicenter. 23 states right now are seeing an upward trend in new coronavirus cases. And look, states are reopening, and this is partly anticipated. We don't know yet what the fallout from Memorial Day and then the protests is ultimately going to be. But part of the problem, too, is that people have been lied to, and they got bad information, and that is going to have a massive impact.
Lied to twice now. First on the mask, then on the protests. Not anybody, just people just whitewashing, saying, no, protests are fine, it's all good, but, you also, the fact that you had to cancel your wedding and all that, that still stands. So people aren't going to listen. They're not going to listen on the mask, they're not going to listen on this, and it's because the public health establishment lied twice. And now we're approaching what I'm not saying it's a second wave, but maybe there is. Who knows, right? Like when Fauci says
Not
something,
good. The
why
numbers
should we
aren't
listen?
good.
I don't know if I trust him anymore. And so you're looking at these types of things and you're just like, the government didn't take care of its citizens economically. It didn't provide the proper public health guidance. There's still not even temperature checks in our airports, as far as I understand. What's going on? I mean, it's just a total and complete failure all around.
Yeah, absolute failure on every level. And this moment of just outright admitting we weren't telling the truth.
Nobody's paying attention.
We were lying to you.
Yeah.
We were, masks. We knew it from the beginning, but we wanted to save our supply. Absolutely
Crazy.
unbelievable.
Absolutely.